1854, the World's Fair in 1854 was when Elisha Otis debuted his elevator. The Otis Elevator Company started. Same year, Benjamin Silliman of Yale diffractionated petroleum. I had to look that up. It means that he figured out how to take petroleum and separate out gasoline from kerosene and the other parts. Big year, 1854. That same year was also marked by debate. The biggest national debate of that year was when Senator Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to form the Nebraska Territory. It sparked a big debate over slavery. It ended up that eventually that year, Kansas and Nebraska became new territories. But there was also a debate that year, 1854, here in Atlanta, that has a lot more implications for us. The First Baptist Church of Atlanta was in dispute, and wouldn't you know it, it was over the music ministry. Here's what the fuss was about. A group in the church wanted to put an organ in the sanctuary. Can you imagine? They wanted an organ to help lead in music. This progressive group, but there was a more conservative group in the church that would have nothing of it at all. They voted it down. This group called it, in the minutes of that meeting, the devil's box of whistles. And they wanted nothing to do with it, not in their church. But a smaller group of progressives left. And they formed their own church, Second Baptist Church. And I suppose they had an organ. And Second Baptist Church is one of the two churches that later merged to become Second-Ponce Baptist Church, which means Verlene can play her devil's box of whistles anytime she wants to. Because this progressive bunch jumped out ahead on that. Then a decade or so after forming Second Baptist, the country was embroiled in civil war. And a lot of you know this story. General Sherman was just out from town, ready to come through on that march that burned the city, and a very courageous young Catholic priest went out to meet General Sherman out from town and confront him and appeal to him to save the downtown churches of Atlanta. As the tradition goes, he made his negotiation out of two arguments. First, he said that the troops would need outposts. They would need military bases in town. They'd need a place to store things. They'd need a place to sleep. Why don't you keep the churches as those places? His second argument, he said, you're underestimating how much your troops will revolt. Your Christian troops will revolt if you go burning down the churches. You need some places anyway. I'm appealing that you save the downtown churches of Atlanta. So General Sherman did spare several of the downtown churches, including Second Baptist Church, which was located then across from the Capitol. And as they used the other churches for military outposts, Second Baptist was the one location left open for worship, which means all of the Christians of all denominations would come together to worship at Second Baptist Church. So it's entirely probable that the first ecumenical worship service in the city of Atlanta was held on Christmas Day, 1864. The church's progressive tradition continued through the turn of the century. Pastor John L. White was pastor in the early 1900s. He was publishing and pushing on race issues in the early 1900s, not 1960s. Historian Henry Warnock wrote that Pastor White pushed moderate racial thought considerably farther than most other Southern Baptists did at a time when it was not especially a rewarding venture. He was a true prophet of change. I have an idea that not an especially rewarding venture is an understatement in the early 1900s. So one of our parents is this progressive group that came out of First Baptist and maintained a progressive social voice throughout its history. But meanwhile, across town, there was another church getting started at about the same time. At about the turn of the century, 1905, First Baptist Church decided to plant a mission church in the growing neighborhood up near Ponce de Leon Avenue in the Druid Hills area. And so in 1905, they called Pastor Millard to this new church start, Ponce de Leon Avenue Baptist Church, and Pastor Millard was excited to come because of the DNA of this place. For one, they had two governor families in this one church. Governor Brown's family worshiped there, but also a former Governor Northern and his family worshiped there. And Reverend Millard came with this incredible sense of purpose, declaring that this is an opportunity for real aggressive work. And I love this line. He said he wanted an arena, not a nest. And these two churches, two different parts of town, had seasons of growth and robust ministry. But then external factors changed. Things beyond their control happened, hardship followed, and the Great Depression hit. And the Depression put enormous financial strain on all the congregations. Many of them in that era folded up completely. The debt of all of their churches was skyrocketing as people moved out of town to go find opportunities for work. But the leaders of Second Baptist Church and Ponce de Leon Avenue Baptist Church saw an opportunity where other churches just wrung their hands and saw doom. And so these two churches came together in 1932 and formed Second-Ponce de Leon Baptist Church. And in doing so, they brought together these two great heritages. Second Baptist Church brought their DNA, their heritage of being a progressive social voice in the city. Ponce de Leon Avenue Baptist Church brought an identity of attracting prominent decision makers in Atlanta, but also this youthful and aggressive approach to ministry. You remember theirs was the pastor who wanted an arena, not a nest. And so the two churches came together, and that is the history of Second-Ponce de Leon Baptist Church in 1,000 words or less. There you have it. By the way, John Roma is opening the Heritage Room today after worship. If you're interested, on your way back to your cars, you might want to stop in and see some of the pictures and the artifacts of those two churches and the great heritage that came together. But these are the people, the traditions that shaped Second-Ponce de Leon Baptist Church. But what you know is that tradition is only one generation away from being lost. And it's important for us to discern which parts of our heritage are the parts we keep because they're the parts that move us forward with a sense of identity and purpose, and which parts of our heritage are just not that important and we cling on to them because we hate change and we don't want anything to change. But the important traditions must be taught and must be passed down from generation to generation, or we're at risk of being untethered from our past. We're at risk of losing the sure grounding of our heritage. And this is exactly where the church at Thessalonica found their problem. You were wondering if I was ever going to get to the text, weren't you? The church there was a young church, new church, and they started losing members to death. Relatives and friends, the church are grieving. These new Christians are now questioning not whether or not they're going to get to see the Lord in glory. Their real question is, am I going to get to see my loved ones? And so Paul writes a warm and pastoral letter to these Christians in this new church and assures them by saying, for since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. This is the comforting pastor assuring them that Jesus is coming again and we will be reunited. But that was the first letter to the church at Thessalonica. 1 Thessalonians. And in 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the return of Christ being soon. The problem is, after they started talking about this letter for a while, they got kind of carried away about it. They got enthusiastic about the fact that Jesus is coming soon. And they got so excited about it that they just became lax in the practice of their faith because, why bother? Jesus is coming soon. If Jesus is coming like Thursday, why are we going to worry about this? And so the traditions of being the church, the grounding of faith, discipleship, storytelling, became insignificant. If Jesus is coming back that soon, why worry about giving? Why worry about getting together for prayer? Why would I have folks over to the house just to get to know them? Why would I continue in the ways of Christian discipleship? Darius, will you serve on the stewardship committee next year? Well, Augustus, I'm not sure we're going to need a stewardship committee next year. Hadn't you heard Jesus is coming back soon? So our scripture this morning is from the second letter to this church. And the writer says this. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed to the effect that the day of the Lord has already come. Let no one deceive you in any way. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm. Hold fast to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by our letter. They were at risk of losing their traditions. They had stopped getting together. They had stopped praying together. They had stopped giving and teaching each other the ways of Christian service. And each generation must take their part in holding fast to the traditions, because if one generation fails at that task, the church fails. There are a lot of different ways to hold on to the tradition. The first and most important tradition we've got to hold on to here is the Christian tradition. It's the tradition of sound theology and biblical storytelling that connects us to every other church, of every other Christian denomination, in every other culture, and of every other time. Every now and then I have lunch with my friend Frank McNamee, who is Monsignor of the Cathedral of Christ the King next door. And he and I give leadership to very different Christian traditions. But he and I are also brothers, bound together by a core belief in the risen Christ. We affirm that abundant life is possible in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and in the great mystery of God's redemptive work, he and I are both saved. We share the most important tradition of the Christian church. But we don't share all the traditions. Some of the tradition you and I share, like the tradition of being Baptist. You and I are also keepers of the Baptist tradition and of a particular Baptist tradition. Walter Sheridan talks about the 4 fragile freedoms of Baptist life, saying that there are 4 historic Baptist affirmations that have shaped our tribe of being Baptist. The first is Bible freedom, that under the lordship of Christ, the Bible must be central to the life of faith in the individual and the church. Soul freedom, the right and responsibility of every person to deal with God directly without somebody else telling you what you have to believe. Church freedom, the Baptist identity that every local church is free under the lordship of Christ to determine their membership, their leadership, their worship style, and the like. And religious freedom. Freedom of religion, for religion, from religion. The distinction that Caesar is not Christ and Christ is not Caesar. The separation of church and state. So we're to hold on to a Christian tradition and a Baptist tradition, but there is another tradition that's even more intimate for us in some ways. We're also to teach the traditions that are peculiar to Second-Ponce Baptist Church. This is our story. We tell our church history, but we also tell our family stories. Part of the tradition is the unique stuff that makes up this place, the delightful individuals, the characters who make this place special. So on this Memorial Day weekend, as a little twist on the theme, I'm giving thanks today for the ones who have gone before us, who have taught us the traditions. Since last Memorial Day, we have had 27 of our members who have died, and many of them carried the tradition for us. I'm going to read the list, all 27 names, and I ask you to hear it in reverent prayers of thanks for the way these people carried the tradition during their time until this year when their faith became sight. Most recently, we lost Roz Sasser on Friday. C.G. Aycock Jr., Timothy Bader, Mo Bennett, Mary Arnold Benz, Juanita Brooks, Dennis Brown, Sandra Brownell, Sarah Hope Creech, Ruth Dickinson, John D. Edwards, Barbara Goldsmith, Colette Hamby, Denton Harris, Jean Jones, Marie Leonard, Dickie Netherland, Brooks Pearson, Henry Phillips, Catherine Pritchard, Sam Reynolds, Elizabeth Shepard, Everett Suiters, Lucille Turner, Betty Villegas, Randall Wood, Wesley Wright. They taught us the traditions. I can't do this by every name on the list, but by illustration, I would ask, if you are in the room and you or one of your children was taught a Bible story by Mr. Sam, raise your hand. Consider how Denton Harris showed us what committed service to the local church looks like. How Barbara Goldsmith modeled God's love for the financially poor. They did it. When it was their turn to tell the story, feed the hungry, do the work, pay the bills, they stepped up. And so we give them thanks. The pastor evangelist wrote the Christian church in Thessalonica and said, in effect, you can't just sit around waiting for Jesus to come back. The church and the Christian movement is one generation from going away. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm. Hold fast to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by our letter. And it is still true. We are only one generation from the story being lost. So each generation must teach the younger ones the story of God's love and salvation in Jesus Christ. Each generation must read the Bible stories to children, chaperone the youth events. Each generation must give significantly to the financial needs of the poor. Each generation must reaffirm what it means to be Baptist. Each generation must tell the stories again of what it means to be a part of this place. We will tell the stories of the ways we have honored our heritage and been a progressive voice in the city. We'll tell the stories about how we've maintained the heritage of being an aggressive ministry outpost. We'll tell the stories of the churches we help plant, the things that make it into the history books, but we also tell the stories that'll never make it into the history books, the ones that are just fun to tell. Miss Austin roller skating on her 90th birthday. This is our family history. We are keepers of the tradition. Now, the story I'm about to tell, I've told before, but some of you weren't here, so I'm going to tell it again. About 15 years ago, I went to a prayer breakfast, downtown Atlanta hotel. Ambassador Andrew Young was the speaker that morning. And he told this story about going to a funeral. It was a church funeral, someone he knew in the church where he and a lot of his family grew up. He was with his cousin, and it was one of these great pillars of the church, one of the ones who had carried the tradition. And so afterwards, they were talking about, what are we going to do? I mean, we can't keep losing these great pillars of the church. I mean, who's going to fill their shoes? Who's going to be around to do for the cause of Christ what they did for the cause of Christ? And after his lament was through, he said his cousin looked up at him and said, Andy, us is them. So what part do you need to play? How will you step up for the cause of Christ so that the next generation will call us faithful? Will you respond to God's call as you stand and sing together?